What's up, guys? Stephen Guadani here with 5 Tool Sports Science right here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We got a good video coming for you guys today. We're going to be going over a study that looked at 28 MLB players and their performance metrics on pitching velocity. All right, this study was called Fastball Velocity in Professional Baseball, Relationships with Trunk Rotation, D2 Flexion, and D2 Extension. A whole list of people did this study, so you can go and check that out and see some of the people that helped coordinate this. But anyways, it's a really cool study. Again, this is looking at MLB players. They were using a Proteus Motion. Again, if you watch some of this video, they're coming out with a lot of really good data just because they have the elite level players using this piece of equipment. So it gives us really strong data and insights into what makes the elite elite. Anytime that we see a study looking at professional baseball players, you should take interest because that's how the elites are moving, and you should want to know what it takes to move like those dudes and compete with those dudes at that level if you have an interest in playing baseball and becoming getting yourself to the highest genetic ceiling possible. All right. So some of the study participants, again, it was 28 players. Their average age was 29.5 years, plus or minus 4.1 years. Their average height was 75.6, plus or minus 2.4 inches. So that puts it right in like the average of the MLB range of that 6'3", 200 pounds, which their weight was 213, plus or minus 20 pounds. Okay. So MLB career length, they had been playing for 4 seasons, plus or minus 3.1 seasons. So these are dudes that have had some experience pitching in the MLB, which is really cool to see in a study. The average fastball velocity was 92.6, plus or minus 2.6 miles per hour. If you follow this channel on some of the studies that we break down, you'll notice that like sometimes when people say elite, pitching, and you go to look at, well, how hard were the dudes throwing in the study? They're throwing like 80 miles per hour. So it's really good when you have a study that is showing guys that are, averaging, 90 plus mile per hour pitches. That's going to be a really quality study, usually a really quality study and information. So, some of the performance metrics that they were looking at. Okay, so it's going to be trunk rotational power, 294.8 plus or minus 50 watts of power. Trunk rotational acceleration, 15.1 plus or minus 3.5 meters per second squared. D2 flexion power, 117.5, 18.8 watts. D2 flexion acceleration, 10.2 plus or minus 3.5. D2 extension power, D2 extension acceleration, etc. I don't want to read off all the numbers. It gets time consuming. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some of like the key points of this. So if you've gone back and watched, we did a video on what separates the 93 mile per hour to 100 plus mile per hour guys, and we talked about some of the Proteus motions of what they're finding in terms of rotational power and acceleration and how that's separating velocity levels even at the professional level. So from guys that are throwing low 90s to guys that are throwing mid 90s to dudes that are throwing 100 plus miles per hour. So what we'll see from this, the hardest throwing guy in this study is throwing 95 miles per hour. That would put him, I would imagine he's probably more going to be like that 350 watts of power guy. But then they were also talking about the importance of trunk rotation acceleration. So to kind of recap on some of that stuff, what they were finding is that anyone under 350 watts of power typically tended to be 93 or under miles per hour. Anybody, in that like 350 to 400 watts of power tended to be, that 94 to 99. And then anybody from 400 to 450 watts of power, they tended to be the 100 plus mile per hour arms. And then they were talking about this acceleration. Okay, so acceleration isn't just the raw force output, okay, in terms of watts of power. It's how quickly you can produce that power. So think of like rate of force development and jumping, just the ability to express that power in a really short amount of time, which makes sense considering pitching. When you hit front foot strike, you have 0.145 seconds on average to release the baseball. So it becomes extremely reactive. You have this small window of time to produce as much force and power as possible. So this acceleration metric becomes really, really important. It shows that you can produce force in a really small window of time. Okay. I think that pretty much covers a lot of the kind of explanation. Oh, one more thing is these trunk rotational power, this is in a shot put press. So like if you're not familiar with the Proteus, it's like this big mechanical looking machine. It's 3D magnetic resistance, and they call it the TrackMan of power measurement, and they can do all sorts of measurements, but this one is going to be a shot put power test to measure rotational power. Okay. So the statistical relationships with fastball velocity. So the big findings were the trunk rotational acceleration, which we just talked about, how quickly you can produce that force. It indicated a moderate positive relationship. Higher acceleration correlates with higher velocity. D2 flexion power shows a significant but smaller effect on velocity. So quickly to talk about just the PNF D2 movement. I don't know, a quick point on this, I don't know if they were doing a split stance or if they were doing like a feet together. So like feet together, you're probably going to get more correlation to the arm and what the arm is producing. But when you split stance in this like very closed chain movement, you're going to start to get some more total body movement. Your whole body is going to kind of start to assist you. So it starts to like, you're holding this handle and you can pull yourself back and then slam down, pull yourself back and slam down. And it actually starts to like from the side, you can kind of see how that kind of almost mimics a pitching movement, but you can use a lot of some rotational aspect in that, the arm and even the front leg. You're using the whole body to kind of produce power. Okay, so just a key point on that. But anyways, they found that the flexion power, which would be going back, shows a significant but smaller effect on velocity, but the extension power and the acceleration, so the downward phase, all right, so this would be like the eccentric, you have an isometric pause, and then you're pulling it down. That downward phase extension and power and extension acceleration was explaining a lot of the velocity variance. So they found that the strongest predictor among the variables explains nearly 39% of velocity variance. That's the D2 extension power. And then the acceleration was also a strong predictor, indicating acceleration in this movement is crucial. And that explained 35%. So if you add both of those numbers up, that's like, 74% of the variance in velocity was found from this test. And again, I don't know if they were doing feet together, so it's like really looking at the arm, or if they were doing split stance, which is probably more of a full body movement. So this was interesting. So some of the non-significant predictors is trunk rotational power and then D2 flexion and acceleration. So I think this is interesting. We talk a lot about trunk rotational power. And so when it's finding that this isn't a significant predictor, you also have to remember too that this is looking at the MLB elite. So they're already producing, when we go back to it, they're producing on average about 300 watts of power up to 350 watts of power, all right? So if you start to look at different levels of play, like from youth to high school to college, there becomes a very direct correlation. But when you're looking at the elite players, it's less of a correlation from the trunk rotational power, and there was more of an emphasis on how quickly they can produce that speed and that power. So if you're a youth or a high school or a college guy, there's less of a gap between the college to pro level. But if you're in that youth to high school, you need to be building up to that 300 watts of power, 350 watts of power if you want to be that 90 mile per hour arm. Okay, so don't get confused that it's like, oh, there's no significant correlation with rotational power. No, that's just looking at in the population of MLB athletes. That's not looking at, from youth to high school to college to pro. There is a direct correlation with velocity and performance gap between level of play between each of those segments of baseball. Okay. Okay, so the takeaways. The strongest contributors to fastball velocity are power and acceleration in the D2 extension movement, again, going down, highlighting the importance of shoulder extension, adduction, and internal rotation strength and speed. I would say that's highlighting it if it's in this, feet forward stance where you can kind of emphasize more of the arm. But if you're going split stance, I think that becomes more total body movement, and probably, you're using a lot more rotational power. You're using a lot more front leg. It really becomes more sport specific to pitching, and it's not, as isolated to the arm. So like in an open chain movement, if you isolated the arm, you could be like sitting down and have your chest resting, and you're just trying to measure, the arm. That would really isolate the movement. But in doing it in a split stance, I don't think you're getting a pure isolation of the arm. I could be wrong on that. That's just kind of my take. Trunk rotational acceleration is also important, suggesting that the speed of core rotation rather than just power output influences pitch velocity. Again, we've talked about this a lot. So it's like you have the raw total power output and power output of watts, but the acceleration matters, because if you can produce a really high force output, like in that shot put press, but you can't do it in the amount of time because pitching has a time constraint. By the time your front foot hits the ground, you have 0.145 seconds. That's this quick. If you can't produce a lot of that force really, really fast, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to translate to velocity as well. All right, D2 flexion power has a smaller but significant role, indicating that shoulder flexion, abduction, and external rotation strength contribute as well. We've done videos on this in the past. This is kind of just more evidence to arm strength levels matter. So when you're pulling that catapult back, when that arm is pulling back, your ability to create horizontal abduction, your ability to externally rotate, you're kind of loading everything up. They're finding that that does have a correlation to ball velocity. So it's like in pitching, you could think about it like when you start to load up, like this is the eccentric component of it. The arm is loading. You're just being patient as everything is getting into position. All right. Once it reaches its maximum and you start to like power hip rotation, ideally you're landing at front foot strike. You're hitting that moment of front foot strike. Everything is loaded. Okay. That would become like that isometric pause. And then there's the concentric explosion part of it. And that PNF D2 extension is really measuring that concentric explosion aspect of it, which is showing the highest correlation to ball velocity, but the ability to eccentrically load and get everything to come back. They're also finding that is important for ball velocity as well. Okay. So training programs should prioritize exercises that enhance these specific movement patterns and their explosive qualities to maximize pitching velocity. All right. So I mean, I think this is just really good information into how the individual athlete needs to be training. Again, if you're a dude that's like, hey, you're in high school or college and you're not throwing 90 miles per hour, there's probably a big chance that you're just not producing enough rotational power. So emphasizing that rotational power and that acceleration is probably going to have a huge benefit for you. You can do, a lot of stuff with this. You can do cable work, med ball throws, Kaisers if you have them, the Proteus Motion if you have it, flywheel training. There's all kinds of modalities that you can use to really start training that rotational power and acceleration. Okay, and then the arm strengthening exercises and utilizing some sort of ballistic emphasis. I've been really liking using like handleballs right now, and you can kind of take a 6-pound ball and you can mimic that PNF D2 extension and you can do it for speed. So I've been liking using that with a lot of the guys. You can kind of use the data that you're getting from this and train some of the aspects that are translating to ball velocity without having to have a $50,000 Proteus Motion. Okay, so I think that this is really great information, and I hope that you guys are going to be able to utilize it as best as possible at home. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. And if you have any ideas for a video that you want me to make, go ahead and leave a comment as well. All right, thanks guys.